as I've said many times, I was in this Degrowth conference in Sweden, and what I haven't told you is that one of the most rewatched presentation for me was made by Alf Hornborg, and not because it was so complex and misunderstandable, but it was so clear. I had to watch it many times over again because it was so clear somehow. And now it gives me great pleasure that Professor Hornborg is here to actually talk about the same things. And a few years have passed, so I think it will be interesting for me as well, again, to talk about money and what money is and how it can be changed to be even better. So please, the floor and the screen is yours, and we can see the slides well.
Great. Thank you very much, Madis, for that very generous introduction. I'm glad I got my points across in the summer of 2018 when we had the big Degrowth conference in Malmö. I remember that very well, particularly because the day before I gave my lecture, there was a forest fire on my farm 4 hours away from Malmö, and I just received an SMS from my wife saying the farm is burning, and we lost about 2 hectares of forest. And this was a time when, of course, we were all talking about climate change, and the summer of 2018, I think some of you may remember, was a very dry summer, and we had lots of forest fires throughout Europe. And other parts of the world as well, and it just became so very concrete, so very tangible when your own forest starts burning. It's never happened to me. I've lived out here for over 50 years, and this really showed me that the climate change was a real thing. It was not just an abstract part of environmentalist discourse. Well, that was just a preamble. Like I said, I really think we need to talk about money if we are serious about degrowth. And of course, the degrowth critique, the degrowth movement goes a long way back. Of course, you could start in the mid-19th century, perhaps with Karl Marx and Sergei Podolinsky and other people who were criticizing the mainstream economy. But I mean, just over the past few decades, we've seen people like Herman Daly writing Beyond Growth. We have a huge number of books that are criticizing growth from various perspectives. Serge Latouche, as you know, coined the concept of degrowth in 1972. Next year, it'll be 50 years since he coined that word. And since then, of course, we've seen a lot of work criticizing degrowth, neoclassical economic theory, and also, of course, the rise of the degrowth movement, which is a strong movement now. Perhaps the main name to think about is Georgios Kallis, who is very prolific. You find his articles all over the place. And he invited me in 2018 to criticize or discuss his new book called Degrowth, which I did in a panel in 2018. And since then, of course, he's published a new book called Limits, which I am reviewing now in August in the Journal of European Sociology. Okay, so what shall we say about money? Let's see if this works. Like I said, the title of each slide in this presentation is a question, and the most basic one, of course, is what is money? And the problem is that although we think that everybody is discussing economy and money and growth, very few people actually think about money as something that they can keep a sort of a distance to. Money is for us a little bit like water is to fish, according to the old proverb. It's something we take for granted and we really don't think about it. But let's try to think about it. I'm an anthropologist to begin with. And that means that I've been trying to approach things that we take for granted in our own European culture. I've been trying to approach those things as if I'd never seen them before, as if they're completely alien and exotic. And believe me, general purpose money, which I will define shortly, is something very strange, something very peculiar. We need to think of it as a very special cultural artifact. Money is a human creation. We are the only species on this planet that could ever come up with such a strange thing as money. It doesn't exist anywhere else but in human societies. And that means that none of the natural sciences, for example, are really trained in understanding what money is. We need to have a background in the humanities or social sciences in order to have concepts for understanding to what an extent money is an artifact, a symbol, a semiotic phenomenon. Money is really an idea about how exchangeable things are. It is a convention that means that a convention is a habit or an agreement. And when we go and shop in a store, we take for granted that if I hand over some money or a plastic card to the people on the other side of the counter, I can take certain things from their shelves and it's mine. This is so natural to us and so self-evident that we don't usually reflect about it. But when we think about it, it's a very strange kind of magic. It's a ritual. Um, let's think about it as if we came from some other planet and suddenly found this species conducting this strange magical ritual by which they can convert anything into anything else. We could convert 1 hectare of Amazonian rainforest into Coca-Cola. Sure. It sounds like a joke, but it's being done all the time. People cut down rainforests and use the money to buy Coca-Cola. So what we're actually doing is trading rainforests for Coca-Cola. Everything is interchangeable. And from the point of view of every individual, what is happening is really a conversion. Substances are converted into something else, but without any basis in physics. All the other material processes in the biosphere can basically be understood in terms of physical or biophysical processes. But in order to understand the economy, we have to go beyond physics. We have to go into the realm of human imagination and human culture. Are you acquainted with the concept of alchemy or alchemy? The early medieval alchemists who thought that they could convert, for example, iron into gold. And we think of that today as a magical idea. You can't just convert iron into gold. But in fact, this is what we're doing every time we are spending our money. We are buying something. We are converting one substance into another through magic, through conventions. And this becomes particularly problematic when we are trading our own labor time in Europe for labor time from China, for example. We know that the average wage in China is about 25% of the average European wage. That means that if you or I buy a pair of shoes or a mobile phone or something else, we are, with money that we have earned from working in Europe, we are actually trading 1 hour of our time for perhaps 4 hours of Asian time. Now, this is how I think we should approach the global economy, what we call globalization. We are trading uneven amounts of time and space, and with space I mean natural resources, for one another. We are converting time and space. We are saving time and space in the wealthy parts of the world uh, by using time and space that are lost to other people, people who work for very low wages or who are accustomed to having their landscapes devastated because the environmental legislation is so weak. So our money is actually a legal claim on other people's labor and resources. If we have money, we are able to appropriate other people's labor time and other people's resources. And the rates at which such labor time and resources are appropriated are determined by market prices. So the world market prices will make it um, beneficial for wealthier parts of the world to appropriate time and resources from the less wealthy parts. Now, here is also the basis for this very strange aspect of money, which is that it is unlimited. It gives us the possibility of accumulating unlimited claims on others. I mean, we can only eat so much food, for example. There is a limit to how much food we can eat, right? Um, all physical things have limits, but there's no limit to how much money we can have or how much money we can want. And this is why the world's wealthiest people, the billionaires, people like Elon Musk and Bill Gates and others, they can keep wanting more and more money because there's no limit to how much money you can have. This, of course, is a basic problem of growth, and it's something that degrowth people need to take into consideration. And I mean, let's not forget that it's very natural to want money. Uh, Money gives you access to whatever you want, particularly if you have large amounts of it. So I would not moralize about wanting money. I think all of us want money. We need to accept that. If any of you would be offered higher wage, for example, would you ever say no? I don't think so. I think we all want to have as much money as possible. And we would be very happy if we won money in a lottery or inherited a lot of money. I don't think we need to feel bad about that. The problem is not us as humans. The problem is money. Like Karl Marx once said, greed is intrinsic to money. It's money that makes us greedy. So whether we are individuals or have corporations or we are nation states, we want to grow our money. We want more money. And I think we just need to face it. That's human nature. Like St. Paul said almost 2,000 years ago, the love of money is the root of all evil. Okay, so what does money do to the world? Like I said, it makes us want to accumulate, to make good deals, to profit, to grow. And when we go into a shop, we usually try to find a good price. When we sell something, including our labor, we want to get as good a price as possible. These are absolutely human, they're predictable properties of being human. We don't need to be ashamed of that. But there are some problems with this. And one of them was discussed by Nicholas Georgescu Reagan in a book called The Entropy Law and the Economic Process in 1971, exactly 50 years ago this year. Basically, what he argues in that very complex and difficult book is that any economic process by which the value of natural resources is increased, because this is what economic processes do, the value, the economic exchange value, any such process will simultaneously mean that from a physical perspective, entropy increases, disorder increases, so that the higher value, the more exchange value a set of resources has, the more disordered, the higher entropy it will have. So the logic of this is very contrary to what neoclassical economists think. They think that growth is perfect. We should always struggle for more growth. But what growth actually does is it automatically rewards resource dissipation with more resources to dissipate. In other words, the more oil we have burnt this year, the more oil we will be able to afford next year to burn next year. So there is a positive feedback reward all the time, which means that we destroy more and more resources. And this is something that is not a concern to neoclassical economists, because ever since the 1870s, they don't think about the material substance of world trade. They only think about money prices. And I would argue that the money prices actually obscures or veils or conceals the physical reality of what the economy does. And about 20 years ago, I argued that we should be talking about what I call ecologically unequal exchange. If we look at the world system of trade from a biophysical perspective, we see that there is a constant net transfer of resources, biophysical resources, to the wealthy areas of the world. And we have shown this in several articles and books. So if you Google ecologically unequal exchange, you will find a lot of empirical support for that argument. And what kinds of resources do I mean? Well, we could talk about matter, material, measured in weight, energy measured in joule, land measured in hectares, labor measured in hours or person year equivalents. All these biophysical resources are simply ignored by neoclassical economists. And they don't even recognize the idea of unequal exchange, because according to their understanding of the world, there can be no unequal exchange. Every market transaction is paid in money, and if everything is paid, then it's fair. Of course, that is not the whole truth. In fact, I would argue that this neoclassical economic ideology was developed at the height of British colonialism in the 1870s, and it worked then to conceal the asymmetric resource transfers of the British Empire, the British colonial empire, which appropriated resources from all over the world, including slave labor on the plantations. But the strange thing is that now, 150 years later, we're still thinking like those neoclassical economists. We're still thinking that money is all there is. Money is the whole story. We don't need to worry about the fact that we're destroying the planet, creating climate change, and creating greater and greater inequalities between rich and poor in the world, because these things are simply not concerns of neoclassical economists. So I would argue that the fictive reciprocity, it's a fictive reciprocity of market prices, obscures the physical realities of how we're not only destroying the planet, but also very unequally exchanging ecological resources. Okay, all this sounds very negative and very pessimistic. Yes, I will agree. But I think we need to go to the bottom of the problem before we start seeing solutions. And I think the solution will have to be a question of redesigning money. It's something most of us don't even think about. I mean, the whole idea that we could have a different kind of money seems really strange to us. But if we go back to, say, 1957, the economic anthropologist Karl Polanyi distinguished between general purpose money and special purpose money. And he showed that in most societies, up until the 18th century, the rule was special purpose money. Now, special purpose money means that you can only buy certain things with money. You can't buy anything with money. I'll give you one example. The most classical example for anthropologists is the so-called TIV people, TIV. It's an ethnic group in Nigeria who, up until the 1950s, when they were studied by an anthropologist by the name of Paul Bohannan, had three different kinds of, I'm not going to say money, but I should say markets or spheres of exchange, so that not everything could be exchanged for everything else. For example, to make it simple, I would argue that for the TIV people in the 1950s, it was not a good idea to exchange food for labor or for prestige goods. So you had at least three separate spheres of exchange, three separate kinds of value: food, labor, and prestige goods. And it was morally wrong to exchange between those spheres. Then the British colonialists came and wanted taxes. So they said to the TIV people, you have to grow cash crops, sell them on the market, make money to pay your taxes to us. And the TIV economy was completely transformed. And of course, they became modern. This is what we mean by modernity, to have one kind of value that can be measured by money and to forget about all the distinctions that earlier cultures have made between different kinds of value. I would also argue that general purpose money was what made the Industrial Revolution possible. And remember that the Industrial Revolution also occurred at the end of the 18th century, in the 19th century. It made it possible to trade slave labor in the colonies for steam technology in Britain, producing cotton textiles in exchange for slaves, and so on and so on. So modern technology is really very much about unequal exchange. And because it is about unequal exchange, it is also about general purpose money. When we talk about money, we usually mean general purpose money, which makes most things into interchangeable commodities, including human time, labor time, and natural space. I would argue that modern technology is actually about saving time and space for the people who have that technology at the expense of time and space lost to the people who cannot afford it. Technology is a way of appropriating time and space from other parts of the world system. So, as I said, general purpose money made it possible to convert slave labor on cotton plantations into British steam engines. Well, another word for this is capital accumulation, but it really doesn't tell us the whole story, because Karl Marx himself believed very much in technology. He thought that technology would emancipate the working class. And I would argue that in order to be consistent about degrowth, we really need to question technology as well, because technology is a mode of accumulation and a mode of resource appropriation, which presupposes general purpose money and ecologically unequal exchange. But if we agree on this so far, it'll be interesting to see if we do. I'm not at all sure about that. But we need to ask ourselves whether mainstream economists today are completely wrong. And this is really a big issue because most people who criticize economists, beginning with Latouche and Schumacher, small is beautiful, Herman Daly, Kate Raworth, who wrote on the donut economy, and of course, Georgios Kallis. Uh, most of these people have argued that the problem is how economists think. Um, and I'm not sure that is the correct way to deal with the issue because I think a lot of the economists are really smart people and they know how to think and they know exactly how money functions. So I would argue that economists are not wrong about the inherent logic of general purpose money. Their task has been to work out strategies for making money grow. They know very well how growth works and they are very skilled at developing strategies for making money grow. In fact, so skilled that the rest of us are simply lost. Most of us don't want to even open a book in economics because it seems so sophisticated, right? All these diagrams and models. But if we think about it from a slightly different angle, uh, it's not that the economists are stupid or wrong or have some strange world view that we don't agree with. The problem is that their thought is shaped by the artifact of general purpose money. Their thinking, ever since the 1870s, has been shaped by that artifact. Now, if you have general purpose money and you do not even think about an alternative to it, then of course your mind will work so as to work out the most efficient strategies for dealing with money. And that's exactly what the economists have been doing. So we really need to reconceptualize the relation between artifacts and people. Humans design artifacts. We all know that money is a human creation, but it also works the other way. Artifacts design them back. Artifacts create us humans, the way we think and the way we act. So what we really need to do, if we agree on this, is to redesign the artifact in order to redesign ourselves. In order to limit ourselves, our consumption, our growth, our destruction of the planet, we need to limit money. So modernity's global crisis derive from the design of modern money. And what we need to do is to redesign money. And believe me, we can do it. In principle, we can do it. It's not stranger than changing the rules of a game of Monopoly. It's all a huge parlor game. You've all played Monopoly, and you know that it usually ends in catastrophe for most of us, right? We lose our hotels and everything in our houses, and we lose all our money and we go bankrupt. Well, we're about to do the same thing with the whole planet. And we keep doing it without understanding that all we have to do is change the rules of the game. Now, when I say all we have to do, it sounds like it's a simple thing, and we all know it's not a simple thing. But I think the first step is to realize that it can be done. The first step is to realize that money can be redesigned. We could redesign money so that all things are not interchangeable on the world market. And my pet idea, I know there are various ideas, but one way of doing it would be to issue a universal basic income to everybody, which could be paid in a complementary currency, a CC they call it, uh, that can only be used to buy locally produced goods and services. Now, I could talk for hours on the practicalities of such a reform, but I just want to say at this point that we could change the money system to get a completely different logic. What kind of changes would this imply? It would radically increase the demand for local produce while minimizing global transports and inequalities, in fact, counteracting what we know as globalization. And globalization, which is really a euphemism, a nice way of expressing imperialism or unequal exchange or appropriation. That's really what it's about, but we call it globalization because it sounds a bit more civilized, you know. Actually, I would argue that globalization is simply a means of continuing colonialism after the colonies have been liberated. It's neo-colonialism. It's the same trade pattern as in the 19th century. It's just that we no longer have imperialism in the old political sense. We now have imperialism in a purely economic sense, and we call it globalization. We know that the artifact of general purpose money will make us as consumers in the global north favor products of low wage labor and lax environmental legislation in the global south. If we want to choose the cheapest commodities in the shops, they will usually come from China or Malaysia or South America, where labor is cheap and the environment can be destroyed without legal problems. So in other words, the artifact of general purpose money promotes ecologically unequal exchange because of its own inherent logic. So I will end by concluding that if we want to stay within the planetary limits to growth, we must recognize limits to what money can buy. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you. And I'll stop share also. Okay.
But of course, we have many, many questions. I imagine I will take the first one because I have the magical tape. But you said that we simply have to redesign money. Do you mean like nations or the European Union or some World Bank? Should we petition the government in Estonia to bring back the Estonian crown we had like until 2011 before the euro?
I know it sounds crazy, and you're quite right to ask questions about the practicalities. Well, actually, I would suggest the greatest political entity that could deal with this at the moment is the nation state. Yes. So you mentioned Estonia. For me, it would be Sweden. But it's not unthinkable, actually, that the parliament could decide that from January 1st, 2022, every inhabitant in the country will receive a certain sum as a universal basic income every month. They will receive a plastic card, and this card will be charged with a certain sum of money. And that money will be in a complementary currency, which can only be used for certain kinds of products. For example, you cannot buy stuff from China or South America. Let's say you buy stuff that is specifically certified to have derived from within, say, 50 or 100 kilometers of the point of purchase. In other words, instead of having it certified as organic or something else, you could have it transport certified. You could know that it has not come from New Zealand or South America or somewhere else, which means that you know that you're buying something that has implied very much less carbon dioxide emissions, for example. Um, but your question was, how would this start? Well, I realize that politically, as yet, it's unfeasible. We're not going to get a political party, at least not a big political party, that would argue for such a reform. I mean, face it, how many of you do believe that we're going to get a new prime minister who says we need to degrow the economy? We need to reduce it by about 80%. We all know that that's not going to happen today. But we all know that it could happen within 10 years or 20 years because we are all facing major crises in terms of climate, in terms of ecology, even in terms of finances. And things could very quickly change. And I think when things change, it's very good to have, to be prepared, to have some kind of a plan B. And I guess what I'm suggesting is a plan B. I don't know if that answered your question there.
Yeah, kind of.
So can you hear me? Or should I move closer? Okay, I will move closer. I support the idea of having like redesigning money, but I think that it would still leave like this, that what is currently the mainstream economy. And the way I see it is that like currently why we are so fond of growth is because like there are people who have this extra money that accumulates, and in order to not lose it to inflation, they are investing it. And because there are so many investors in different companies, these investors expect to get something in return so that their money wouldn't lose value. And that's what is like basically pressuring the companies to always increase their growth, or like to grow, to be able to pay back their investors more than the investors put in. And so I think that currently the growth is really incentivized in a sense that we like want to pay back the investors more. So I'm thinking like, how could we redo the incentives so that the growth wouldn't be so prevalent in the economy? And maybe like if you would have some good suggestion for any sort of books that actually like describe how we could actually have this change, then I would be very happy to read anything
Yeah. Okay. Well, first I'll begin by saying that I have this plan or this reform that I mentioned. I have written about it in, at the moment, the two best sources are one. I published a book with Cambridge University Press 2 years ago. It came out in paperback, so it's fairly available at this point now. Called Nature, Society, and Justice in the Anthropocene. And the final chapter in that book is all about how money could be redesigned. But that chapter actually is based on an article that I published in the Journal of Political Ecology. And I think it's open access online. It's called How to Turn an Ocean Liner. How to Turn an Ocean Liner. It should be available open access, and that will give a more extensive presentation of it. But to answer your question about investors and their demand for more money, though, I would warn against all the traditional ways we have of explaining growth. I mean, even these well-meaning people like Kate Raworth and Herman Daly and even Georgios Kallis have their own explanations of growth. I remember Mary Mellor, for example, who wrote on positive money, public money. I mean, all these people, let's go back to Margaret Kennedy. About 50 years ago, she wrote books about an economy without interest. If you had money without interest, she argued, we would not have the same incentives for growth. And I would like to see all the other explanations as ad hoc explanations, including the notion of public money, positive money. I would argue that none of these explanations actually changes things. I mean, we basically have, for example, an interest-free economy today. If I have money on the bank, I don't get any interest in Sweden. There's almost no interest at all. And still the economy grows. So obviously Margaret Kennedy was wrong, right? And I would argue the same way. I think the logic of growth is not a question of whether or not there's interest on it, whether or not the investors want more, whether or not it's produced by banks or by governments. You know, all these different kinds of explanations we get explaining growth, I think, are not helping us. What we really need to look at is the artifact of money, because regardless of how it is produced, whether or not there's interest, and so on, it is still general purpose money. And general purpose money will give us incentives to buy the cheapest things. And as long as we have universal interchangeability and a global market, we will buy stuff from China and Brazil and perpetuate the problems of money. So I would say that the problem is the design of money itself, not all these other circumstantial aspects that were discussed by all these other critics of neoclassical economics.
So I understand where you're coming from, but what I'm mainly concerned, or like what I'm mainly thinking about is like, how could we make the change? Like, how could we incentivize the people that are currently driving the growth, or that are putting in their companies yearly plan to grow, I don't know how many X percentages. So how could we incentivize these people who are making these decisions for the company to increase profits? Like I completely understand that maybe like what we are currently doing in the economy is not the best way, but I'm just thinking like, how could we actually drive it to where we want it to be?
Yeah, I realize, okay, I realize that I'm probably more critical or despondent, which means having given up hope about global capitalism than you are, because I don't think the problem is how to incentivize enterprise. I think the problem is how our grandchildren are going to survive.
True, I agree with that, definitely.
Okay.
So hi Alf, it's very nice to have you here. I myself am an alumnus of the Department of Human Geography at Lund University. So coming from a similar fruitful environment, my question is about kind of geopolitics, and it's about so. As I understand, the US and the UK back in the 1970s were the ones who were only mainstreaming the modern day capitalism, and back then they were among the most among the wealthiest countries. They still are, of course. So they benefited the most from it. However, today China is increasingly, becoming wealthier and is kind of extracting this free trade and this kind of the same system that was built by, for example, by the US. And now, because the growth of China is kind of threatening the position of the US, and they can benefit from the system, the US is increasingly introducing these protectionist measures. And the question is just, it would be interesting to have your thoughts on, so how do you think that this could shape our kind of this free trade economics? How can this shape what money can possibly buy? Because many examples that you brought also, we're buying from China, but we're not protecting so that we wouldn't buy from China.
Soon China can buy everything.
And how can this kind of support this degrowth agenda?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think China would be very happy about the idea of degrowth. China has made a tremendous career on selling cheap Chinese labor on the world market and selling the Chinese environment and resources cheaply. And I mean, these kinds of changes and shifts in the world system have been with us for a long time. If we go back 150 years, Britain was the main center of capital accumulation in the world. If we go back 50 years or so, America, well, even more, 70, 80 years, the United States took over more and more of that position. So I'm not saying that the world system is static in any way. It certainly changes all the time. And I think it's very reasonable to expect China to be the next economic center of the world, say 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. And I think this is very much about what the rhetoric on protectionism is all about. But of course, the economists will never like the idea of protectionism. And I don't think protectionism in itself, in a traditional sense, is a very good idea, because it does create political tensions, even world wars. I mean, Karl Polanyi, who I mentioned before, clearly saw that the First World War and even the Second World War were products of nations that were cutting down on global trade. So the economists have a point that globalized trade makes it less likely to get a world war. But what we're seeing so far is simply more of the same. Global capitalism assuming new forms, China ascending at the cost of the United States and so on. And this, this Belt and Road Initiative from China clearly shows that they intend to keep a very lively global trade going. And this, I would argue, is very much in contradiction with the hopes we have for lowering our carbon dioxide emissions and so on. So I unfortunately don't see very much in current trends in world politics or the development of the world economy that would support a degrowth transition. The only hope, it sounds very cynical to call it hope, but the only chance I think we have is of the world system running into a major crisis. Once again, I'm more despondent than most people are about the possibility of continuing as we are doing now. I think degrowth is our plan B. It's what we have to be able to fall back on. And in itself, that implies a lot of very tangible things, like developing skills at growing your own food, at community cooperation and cohesion. It's very important, I think, to localize the economy and to make it possible for the local economy to survive in a situation when we are no longer able to import stuff from other continents. We noticed this during the pandemic very clearly. And I mean, let's take a very practical situation. Given the big droughts that we see around the world, I heard that even in British Columbia, Canada, they had 47 degrees centigrade the other day. It's not too far-fetched to imagine that one of these years we're going to have a huge harvest failure. And if we do get a huge harvest failure, we're going to have great problems feeding almost 8 billion people who are used to buying their food on the market. We need to be able to develop a resilience and a local food security to withstand such risks. We're very much at risk now. And I think this is the most important thing that politicians could actually do, is to create local security. And it's the last thing that the politicians want to do. Sweden, I can tell you, is probably the most neoliberal country there is today, and we don't have any preparations. I don't think we'd last 2 weeks if we were cut off from food, and it's terrible. And just raising the issue is not very politically correct, but we're living in a very, very vulnerable period of time. This was a long and winding answer to your question, but
it's an interesting one, definitely. Thanks.
I wanted to ask about these principles of economy. So in my mind, I connected the basics of economical growth and inflation and deflation, and example of Japan came into my mind, that if we would have a deflation, then it could theoretically lead us to degrowth, because people are not so motivated to grow and buy too much. And what economists say, that we are like living in a catastrophe in Japan. But actually, if we look it from this perspective, then maybe they have reached like holy goal, but accidentally, and they are not happy at all.
Yeah. Yeah, Japan is really an interesting case. You know, if I would have had another PowerPoint here, I would have shown you a satellite image of nighttime lights. I don't know if you've seen these satellite images where you see certain areas of the world lighted. It's the lights that you can see from satellites at night times. And Japan is one of the 3 areas in the world that really glows in the night. It's Japan, the European Union, and United States. These are the 3 core areas. And of course, China is glowing more and more now. And I usually interpret that as being capital accumulation seen from outer space. You can actually see, the technical industrial infrastructure that has grown. And I just want to say, because we think of Japan sometimes as being an example of degrowth, but I would not agree. Of course, Japan's economy has stagnated, but it's still one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And this becomes very evident if we map the resource flows, the biophysical resource flows to and from Japan. And a colleague of mine did this in an article some years back, where we showed that in terms of both materials weighed in tons, in terms of energy, in terms of ecological footprint, that is land, and in terms of embodied labor, Japan was importing a net transfer of resources from the rest of the world. I think we had data from the year 2007, and it showed, like for all the other major centers of the world economy, there was a net transfer of resources. And I particularly noticed that the average Japanese citizen requires 1 hectare of land, eco-productive land, outside of Japan, just to support his or her consumption. This means that if you have a small, young, average family, 2 young adults with their first child, you have 3 people, and you multiply that by 1 hectare, you get 3 hectares. So if you're newly married, have an average income, and get your first child, your little household will require 3 hectares of agricultural or eco-productive land outside Japan. So Japan, yes, the economy has stagnated, but there's still enormous amounts of capital in Japan, and Japan is still a country that imports enormous amounts of resources from other areas. And I don't know how long that will be able to continue, but it still is the case.
Shortly, I would ask another one. If it's the case that the economy has like reached a plateau in Japan, but you're just saying that the plateau is too high by the consumption. So like in principle, it's maybe like one first step towards some goal, but yeah, you're saying just the absolute amount of resource using is too high in Japan, for example.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is easiest to show in terms of ecological footprints. You've all seen probably the statistics from the Worldwide Fund for Nature, I think it's called now, which shows the average ecological footprint for each country. And by the way, Sweden, I think, is number 8 from the top. So our politicians shouldn't be all that proud about our capacity to become ecological. But Japan is also quite high. It imports very much from the outside. It imports a lot of embodied land. Almost all its fossil in the world to have ecological footprints like that. Because if everybody lived like a European or a Japanese, we would require 4 more planets, you know, that kind of rhetoric. So in order to produce a more fair world, we need to lower our consumption patterns fundamentally, both in Europe and Japan, and of course the United States.
Yeah, my question actually links very well with this. I wanted to ask about these ecologically unequal exchanges, and could one example of this be the news that we hear daily that the solar panels are getting cheaper and cheaper? And what does it actually mean that solar panels are getting cheaper and cheaper? What does it actually imply, or what's the actual cost, or where does the cost go if it gets cheaper?
Yeah, but that is an example of it, precisely the fact that we have unequal ecological exchange. But it's politically very incorrect to say that. I want to refer you to a PhD thesis in human ecology that was just defended 2 months ago by Andreas Roos, R-O-O-S. It's called Renewing Power. And he shows in very great detail that the German, when Germany started investing in solar panels, it was possible because they were produced in China with the very low Chinese wages. And this means that what for us is to become sustainable, to use renewable technology, is really to exploit low-wage labor in another part of the world. And we can see this pattern in many cases. Some years back, everybody was talking about ethanol. Remember when all the cars would go by ethanol? Now, ethanol, the best ethanol and the cheapest ethanol is produced by using Brazilian sugar cane. And we all know that the production of sugarcane ethanol from Brazil means that is produced with very low wages from a European perspective and very low land rent produced with Brazilian land. So that's another example of how, in order to become, as we say, sustainable, Europeans need to exploit other continents. That's why I'm very, very suspicious of all these technological solutions, electric cars. You all know that the cobalt in the car batteries in these fantastic new electric cars usually comes from mines in Congo, where you send down little children into dangerous mine shafts to pick up this cobalt, and they get like a couple of dollars a day or something like that. So our way of becoming technologically sustainable is very much a means of appropriating resources from other parts of the world. And of course, you realize this is not very nice to say to all these people who are arguing for a Green New Deal and so on. And many of my best friends have thought that I have changed my views on the world when I say these things. You know, they think I'm part of the oil lobby. But I certainly do not want to defend the use of fossil fuels. We have to get away from fossil fuels. But using solar panels is also a question of global distribution, a global fair trade. And the question was put, is an excellent illustration of ecologically unequal exchange. The fact that we have material resources being asymmetrically transferred, but in terms of money, it looks perfectly fine. In terms of money, you don't see the unequal resource transfers. In other words, how much labor, how much land, how much materials have been invested in that technology in order to make it possible for Europeans to buy it.
I'm going to ask the next question. I'm going to play the devil's advocate. Can you hear me, by the way? It seems to be a little bit difficult.
Could you please use the microphone?
Yeah, I'm gonna get really close to the microphone. So
I'm going to play the devil's advocate, and I've heard a lot of people say that actually, that the global north, buying things from the global south actually benefits the global south, because there are people that get jobs and actually have better income. For example, if you look at the Foxconn, the company that makes iPhone parts in China, there are millions of people working there, and these people are happy. They're actually very happy that they're able to get a job that pays relatively well in Chinese terms. So it provides jobs. And another aspect of this is that if people, obviously people want to have a better way of life, and so they can either get jobs in China at these Western companies, or they can migrate to other countries. Like there is refugees and other people that are coming from less wealthy countries moving to, you know, Western Europe or even Estonia now. So those kinds of things happen. And
I see your point. Yeah, I very often run into this question, and I remember many years ago having a radio debate with a person who made the same point, that we should not stop buying these Chinese commodities because it's what's going to make it possible for China to become sustainable. I didn't have an answer at that point, and I left the radio studio disappointed. I had the feeling that I had lost the debate. But on my way home, I came up with this strange connection. I thought I had heard that argument before. Yes, I had. It was Rudyard Kipling's argument in A White Man's Burden in 1899. At the height of the British colonial empire, Rudyard Kipling, who wrote the Jungle Books, also wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden. And the point of the poem is this, that the British people are carrying such a heavy load because they have to civilize the rest of the world. So the rest of the world, Africa, India, and so on, should really be so happy because the British Empire went there and colonized them. We're doing them a service by colonizing them. And even if the comparison sounds horrible, I would like to say the same thing today. When the economists say that people in Africa should be happy when we give them jobs, we're saying the same thing. Should they be happy because we exploit their cheap labor? You know, this is the way we understand the world. And we really need to rethink this. And this, I think, is very central to degrowth, to break out of the hegemony, as Gramsci called it, the hegemony of our worldview. I recently examined a master's thesis in human ecology in Lund. It was a Danish person who was looking at deep sea mining. You know that this is the latest thing, to go deep into the Pacific Ocean to fish up these nodules of cobalt and other rare minerals for our new renewable technologies. And this Danish girl, she made this reflection that I thought was really profound. She said that she wrote in her thesis that there was a point when she was interviewing the people working with deep sea mining about why they wanted to go to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. And their answers seemed so reasonable, so perfectly rational. They wanted to prevent climate change. They wanted to have renewable energy, blah, 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 blah. So that there was a point when this author of the thesis felt that she was being naive, that of course we should go deep sea mining. It's only natural. But then she took her argument one step further, and she remembered Antonio Gramsci's words about hegemony. And she said to herself, no, there is nothing absolutely natural about going to the bottom of the Pacific in order to have electric bicycles and Facebook servers and streaming and whatever we're using. I mean, there's nothing absolutely natural about human beings always wanting more and more electricity. going to the bottom of the sea to make it possible. There are Marxists like Aaron Bastani who argue that we need to mine asteroids to get all these minerals. You see how far, literally, we are prepared to go to keep our technology working. This is modernity. This is the cultural hegemony of the modern worldview. And we should be wary of it. It's very easy to accept their argument. I mean, I understand your point that, okay, they're making money down there in Africa, so it's a good thing for them, right?
I mean, they're suffering and there's a lot of poverty. So this actually helps them come out of poverty. Isn't that a good thing?
Okay, but then my response would be, where did the poverty come from? They haven't always been poor.
Right, right.
Poverty has been produced by centuries of colonialism. And if we do like Hans Rosling and start history in the year 1800, it will look like everything is getting better. But 1800 was a low water mark. It was a period after which European empires had for a long time been destroying the economies of other countries. My specialty is actually the Inca Empire in the Andes. And I can tell you that when the Spanish conquistadors went there in the 16th century, it was much a better place to live than it is for most Peruvians today. So poverty is something that we have produced, and now we're telling people how to get rid of it by doing something that serves our purposes.
I agree.
So
yeah.
We have to break free of this, the hegemony of this modernist model.
Just a quick comment. Was the person you mentioned in your last reply the author of the book Fully Automated Luxury Community?
Yes, Bastani, exactly. I mentioned
one view of
Bastani.
the world, so we will take machines and they'll produce everything for us and nobody has to worry.
Yeah, well, fortunately, most of my Marxist friends agree that Bastani is completely crazy. I mean, he actually argues that technology is all about information. All you need is information. It's like technology doesn't have material form. It doesn't require resources or energy. And if technology is only information, what's the point of historical materialism? I thought the whole idea with historical materialism was to understand the material nature of the economy, the fact that we need resources. And if we realize that, we realize that there are limits to how much resources we can use. But, you know, for Bastani, no problem. We'll go to Mars or asteroids and we'll find the stuff. It's all information anyway. Well, there have been some very strong critiques of Bastani's book, not least by degrowth people like Gareth Dale, for example. So, but it's interesting to see how even Marxism has, or some parts of Marxism has been very much influenced by the modernist belief in modern technology. We talk about Prometheanism, this Promethean understanding that technology will save us. And we have to understand technology as being part of the problem, as being something that is made possible by colonialism, imperialism, and ecologically unequal exchange. I see a hand raised. I just want to finish this point. I don't think it is a coincidence that the Industrial Revolution occurred in Britain in the late 18th century. It's not a coincidence that neoclassical economic theory and modern technology, steam technology, was developed in the middle of the mightiest empire that the world has ever seen. This should tell us that there is a strong connection between technology, general purpose money, and colonialism, imperialism, unequal exchange. We have to break out of that model.
Will the idea of competition stays with within the current economic policy, and if reform it with the focus special purpose money, the idea of competition still stays, and therefore incentives for pollution and all kinds of other destructive behaviors still stay. So how to counter that? Like this?
Yeah. Okay, right. I understand. I think I understand your question. I would argue, actually, once again, that I don't think competition is really I don't think the kind of competition we're seeing today between corporations is very helpful. As I mentioned before, I'm an anthropologist, and I have over the years become acquainted with very many different kinds of cultures, not least through the ethnographies that I've read. And I realized that there's a fantastic amount of variation in how cultures organize their societies, and there are different ways of organizing competition. And I think you mentioned at some point you think that it's in human nature to want to do exciting things, interesting things. Well, certainly yes, and modern civilization is not the only way of doing interesting things. Of course, it's interesting to destroy the planet, but there are other ways of being interesting, and other cultures have practiced those interests. So I think we have very much to learn from other cultures. And I wouldn't buy the story about competition being necessary for development that we're getting, from all kinds of people. So I don't think that reorganizing the economy along more or less the lines I suggest would really be a disadvantage from that perspective. But I may have misunderstood your question. I may even have missed large parts of your question. So you're welcome to
I also
expand.
have one question. It's that it's okay. No,
Sorry, I'll just try to do it quick. I would just like to get your opinion on why your radical revolution is more feasible than what we sometimes have talked about, that maybe the prices of goods and services should just reflect the environmental destruction behind it. That at the moment, prices don't represent the forests being cut down and that sort, wouldn't that be easier to push for than for the whole radical change of the system?
I don't think so, no, because I guess for 50 years now, I have been struggling with that argument. This is the mainstream argument. This is what the environmental economists are saying, the people in neoclassical economic theory. They're saying we have to internalize the externalities, right? We have to pay nature. We have to pay the poor people so we don't exploit them. And I think it's logically a completely flawed argument, because if we're saying that problems arise because we do not pay enough, then we are implicitly saying that nature and even labor has a correct price. And if we only pay that correct price, everything will be fine. I don't believe in that. First of all, how do we calculate the correct price of cobalt? Who is going to calculate it? There's no correct price of cobalt. There's only a price at which people are willing to sell cobalt. And that depends on how low wages people are paid and how easy it is to dig it from the ground. But there's no way of saying that nature has a correct price. So the whole problem is that we quantify natural resources in terms of money. That is the problem, that we evaluate nature in terms of money. Money does not have a price. I usually say money cannot compensate for entropy. It doesn't matter how much we pay for the resources. We still cannot compensate for the second law of thermodynamics, the entropy law. The more we produce, the more we destroy. That is the logic of growth, according to Georgescu-Roegen.
Okay, I also have.
So the optimum.
Yeah, I have this kind of question.
Go ahead.
We have already invented the cars, and if you want to say to the people that it's not ecological, then what you should say to the people that may go and ride back with horses or something, because you said that even the electric cars are bad. So what should people do? Some people go to work every day, their life depends on the cars, and also we have planes and trains, and then people want to travel, and you just cannot say to them that hey, you cannot travel anymore, even if you don't have any alternative to them as well. So
you're absolutely right. I mean, who wants degrowth? Who really wants it? I mean, none of you do. I know you're all involved in degrowth, but I think none of you would really like to reduce your consumption by 80%, do you? Still, you realize that we have to do it. You know, it's like the cars. You say people want to drive, yes, but please remember, it's only a global minority that even can think about driving a car. According to an optimist like Hans Rosling, only 1 billion out of 7.5 billion people can actually buy a car. So that's a 1/8, less than 1/8 of the world's population. So we can't just sit in Europe or Japan or North America and say, but people want cars, so how can we ask them not to have cars? We really have to get away from this way of understanding our consumption as natural. But I completely agree with you that from a democratic political perspective, we're not going to get any big changes in the situation we're in right now. We're not going to get people in Sweden or Estonia to vote against cars, for example, because we're just too used to them, and we have the money, and we're simply too comfortable with them. But like I said, we are a privileged minority of the world to have them. And sooner or later, we will find that we will have to change our understanding of what cars really are. I suggest you read Ivan Illich, one of the major figures in the history of the degrowth movement. Read Ivan Illich, what he says about cars. He has some very interesting things to say about cars. For example, do you know what the average speed, the real speed of the car is? The average velocity of the car? It's about the same as if you had a bicycle. Because what he did is he divided the annual distance that a car travels by the amount of time that a car owner invests in that car. He repairs it, he washes it, he looks for a parking space, he works to pay for it. He spends thousands of hours just to have a car. So in terms of the distance traveled, he could just as well have a bicycle. It would take as much time. So Ivan Illich is one of the inspiring people of the degrowth movement. Please read Ivan Illich.
I was about to quote him as well, saying that the question was, how do we change society? And I think it was his quote that something in the lines that living with less cannot be taught, or you can't teach it, it must be learned. So you do it when you have the necessity to do it, otherwise it's very hard to kind of argue for it. But and I want to comment about this, the right price of things. Another problem is that due to this huge inequality, there's always somebody who has the money to buy whatever is priced, whatever price it is. So there is somebody who will fish out the last fish from the ocean because they have the money. It doesn't matter what's the price, they have the money. But my question is on this basic income. Now with Corona time, we saw very interestingly that actually the United States was issuing these stimulus checks to people, and this is the most capitalist country in the world. So I'm not sure what to think about this. Is it like a very nice, like a socialist jest, or it's a very capitalist trick now?
Well, this is just an example of how absolutely vulnerable and strange the whole system is. I mean, already before the pandemic, as we all know, the United States had borrowed money over its ears, and now with the pandemic, it's just continued. And I'm inclined to think of this borrowing of billions and billions of dollars in the same way that David Graeber argued in his book Debt. Some of you may have seen it. He says that the debt of the United States it works like tribute. It's not, I mean, when you think about how the American debt functions, you simply have other nations pouring billions of dollars into the United States every year. Okay, it's called loans, but you could also call it tribute. because as long as America is able to maintain its credit worthiness, other countries are paying money to the United States to keep the whole system going. And like David Graeber argued, the debt that United States has accrued will never be paid. Nobody has any plans of ever repaying it. It's just a mechanism for appropriating money from the rest of the world. And in fact, I've worked on the idea that we have seen different kinds of imperialism over the years. We have had agrarian imperialism, we've had mercantile imperialism, we've had industrial imperialism, the British Empire, and now we have financial imperialism, which simply means you're handling around money. And this is exactly how governments have handled the pandemic, by paying extra money to keep consumption going and to keep enterprise going. And for many people, it's simply a warning of an even greater financial crisis than we had in 2008, because some people are arguing that it's a huge balloon that will finally burst, that will finally blow up. Did I understand your question correctly? Was this an answer or a response?
Yes.
Okay, okay.
I have a more personal question about mental health. So knowing all of this and living in the system, how do you remain mentally healthy?
That is a wonderful question. Well, I don't know if I'm the right person to answer it. Yes, that's a good question. I think we need to distinguish between our intellectual understanding of the world and our insight that things cannot continue this way forever. Maybe it will continue for 10 years or 50 years or even 100 years, but something major and drastic will happen. And that's where the second part of our personality will have to come in. That's where we might have a plan B to come up with at that point. But I will sincerely admit that it's a bit of a relief to be turning 67 as I'm turning this year. And I know that most of you are probably around 40 or 50 years younger than I am, and for you it's much more of a reality. But I can comfort you with the fact that I had basically this same view of the world when I was your age. And what I did when I was 23, what my wife and I did when we were 23, was we moved out into the countryside, into the farm where I'm sitting now. And outside my window, I have a garden where I grow my potatoes, and we have some sheep in the barn, and there's a lot of fish in the water, and there's firewood in the woods, and we have stoves so we can heat the place with firewood in the winter. You see where I'm getting at. I'm hoping that my children or grandchildren will be able to manage life in a very different world than the one we're seeing now. Well, that would be a response to your question on how to stay mentally healthy, to have one level where we're living a normal life, and another level where we're realizing that things may change, but we are prepared.
So
most people are not prepared. Most people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have a follow-up survival
Most people
question.
not prepared.
How to prepare then? That you're
Okay.
talking about this major collapse that's probably going to happen in my lifetime. What do you think will trigger it, or what should I look out for that? Okay, that, let's say, not politically correct, that shit is about to hit the fan. You know, that.
Yes. Yeah.
That, do you think there are like clear things that we can look out for to see that the collapse is coming, or what?
No, I think I've been reading quite a lot on collapse as a historical phenomenon. I mean, collapse has been recurring. You all know the Roman Empire, but you have the Soviet Union collapsed, right? You have had different kinds of collapses. And I think most of the time we are too afraid of collapses. We think of them as being disasters, and they don't have to be. Very often they're just a question of economic decline and a lowering of social complexity. And it's impossible to say what straw will break the camel's back, as the proverb says. Most collapses are the result of a combination of factors: pandemics, financial crisis, environmental problems, problems with climate, declining harvests, and so on. So actually, violence and war is not always the determining factor at all. The Maya collapse in Yucatan, for example, apparently, according to the archaeologist, was a question of people leaving the cities and moving away to somewhere else on the Yucatan Peninsula. You can't see very much evidence of people suffering. So I'm unable to answer your question, of course. I can't predict history, but I believe that the financial system we're living in is highly problematic. And I believe that that could very rapidly change. We have seen financial crisis before, but perhaps we've only seen ripples compared to what might happen. And it's quite possible that the economic responses that governments have had to the pandemic have actually increased the risk for a major financial crisis. And when the pandemic was at its height a year ago, I was reading every day this electronic journal called resilience.org. Some of you may have seen it. It's from the Post-Carbon Institute, resilience.org. And I actually subscribe to it for free, but there are some really interesting articles in it. And particularly from last year, showing, it says my internet connection is unstable, so I may be losing you, but I'll try to get back. Anyway, I really recommend resilience.org because there were several analyses also of what might happen to the economy. And there were people arguing that the 2008 financial crisis was child's play compared to what we may have in store. So I think it's always good to have to be prepared somehow. And we're living in a part of the world where there is actually a lot of abandoned farmland, abandoned cottages, abandoned houses. So to keep one foot in the garden is not a bad idea, I would argue.
I have a follow-up, I guess, comments just to continue the discussion. And it's I often have a feeling right now as well that we're talking about ourselves. So how do we, what can we expect? And what is coming up? But at the same time, if we're going already to many parts of the world, I mean, the collapse is already there. If you're going to the Philippines and seeing the increasing number of typhoons, if we're going right now, I guess California with the heat waves, these are already collapses and
literal house collapses.
Literal house collapses in Miami. So actually, but mostly I'm thinking right now of the developing countries. Like we're thinking here, how do we save ourselves? How do we go to the? And I think, of course, I think it's finding a country house and being resilient locally, that is important. Yeah. But at the same time, I think it's important not to forget that the collapse is already in many other places. And what can we do in a global north about this? And so I feel that it's oftentimes missing in the discussions and also like among ourselves.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It seems like the people who are most worried about a collapse are living in the most comfortable parts of the world. In Europe, in North America, this is where we talk about collapse. For most other people, the collapse is already here. As you say, for most other people, daily life is suffering. It's about getting food. It's being a refugee, running away from climate problems, from war, and so on. So you're absolutely right. And historically, you can see that many collapses have actually been a sense of relief for the majority. I ran into this many decades ago. An archaeologist who said that maybe the Roman collapse or the collapse of the Maya was experienced as a tax relief for the population at large, who felt that finally those elites sitting in their cities, in the wealthy parts of the world or the country, could no longer appropriate their time and their resources. So maybe that's what collapse really is. It's a way of equalizing the world a little bit, letting Colombian farmers use their farmland for other things than producing our coffee beans.
But I think now it's time to wrap it up. It was a very good Q&A. So another round of applause, please.
Thank you all. I've enjoyed your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you for a good discussion.